So, Charles, thank you very much for joining me in Studio 2 for a discussion about the military. Um, this is going to be fairly loose, I think, but over quite a few months, you and I have had a number of discussions where we've said we really ought to get together to talk about the military, and today's the day. Um, I think there's so much to cover that we'll just do as much as we can in today's conversation, and then we'll look to do another episode, or maybe some more episodes. So, um, what counts here? I think I'm going to pull I'm going to pull rank by virtue of my age, and I think I'll start off by just saying, tell me a little bit about your career, because I know quite a few things about you, but it would be great to hear you tell us a little bit more about
Mhm.
yourself, and I'm sure the audience would like to know that. And once you've done that, I will reply with a bit about my ancient heritage
Mm.
in the Royal Navy.
Well, come on, Brian. Not that ancient
Well,
in the grand scheme of things.
well, maybe.
But yeah, I think this will be part of an evolving conversation. I mean, not least because of the speed with which not just the armed forces are evolving, but the way that they're being treated, dealt with by their political masters, but also by the society that puts them forward. And I think there's a huge amount to talk about. Always, like you say, we've spoken a lot leading up to this discussion about the sorts of things that we do need to talk about. Whether or not we'll get into much of that today, I can't be quite certain. But I think what I'd like to do is sort of talk. Of course, we will, I'm sure, talk about things that might not make that much sense to people that perhaps haven't been in the armed forces. So what I'd like to do is try to make a particular point about speaking as though somebody listening has no idea what it might be like to be in the armed forces, either then or now. And the reason I say that is that I think one of the things that has changed in actually, fun enough, in both directions in the period of time that I've been sort of um, within the military orbit is how people are conditioned via various propaganda exercises to either regard the military as friend or foe. And I've seen this sort of ebb and flow over the years. Now, for myself, my first sort of engagement with the armed forces was back in the mid 90s, whilst still at school. And that was a period of quite high turbulence after the options for change program. There'd been a lot. I'm sorry, I should qualify that I'm specifically talking about the army, whereas you're going to be primarily talking about the navy, and I think that's a distinction worth making. But at that point, the with the collapse of the Soviet Union and all the fallout from that, the army specifically was put in a position where things were being made to change, definitely not in a way that people were universally happy with. There were a lot of very uneasy regimental amalgamations, which, to put that in the sort of civvy speak, is, I suppose, a form of a merger, or indeed could be perceived as an acquisition between two different entities, and therefore personnel inevitably have to disappear. There's a sort of rebranding exercise, and if it's not managed correctly, there are a lot of upside down smiles because people are left in some way bereft of what they regard as their identity. And I think this is a thing that's really worth talking about. We joked before recording that we're both wearing check shirts, so I said, well, there's a conversation about uniform there, and I mean that partially glibly, but actually there is a serious point, because I think, again, to look at it from the outside in, for a lot of people, looking at the armed forces creates a sort of sense of revulsion at the idea of being told what to do, of being a tiny cog in a machine, of not having any control over your own destiny, and all this sort of thing, with which I sympathise. I understand why people say that. That's not my perspective at all. My view of it is that you go into one of these systems in order to hone your skills in a particular job that means you are going to be used, okay, fair enough, used to the very best of your ability, and you actually do exert a huge amount of control over the way in which you do that. And the uniform part is really significant in that by making everybody look the same, you're creating a sense of compassion. You're creating a sort of family situation in which people are subconsciously, at least, if not consciously, feeling like they're all part of one body, and therefore they will go above and beyond to look after and protect those people around them. And a uniform is absolutely critical to that, as are standards of behaviour and all the rest of it. And that's something that I think has slipped dramatically. So I don't want to veer too far off the point, but yes, in my sort of first engagement was mid-90s, and with sort of school and university and whatnot. It wasn't actually until the 2000s that I then went to the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, which is where the officer training has happened for many years. It's now the only place that officer training happens for the army. It's a year-long course. It is very, very physically demanding. It's also supposed to be intellectually demanding, and it's supposed to put you out the other side where you're in a position to be able to manage the responsibility of looking after, if you're an infantier like I was, around 30 soldiers. And that's it's largely a welfare job, but specifically as an officer, as a commander, you're supposed to have the capability to plan in such a way that you're going to achieve success on the battlefield, and that again is ultimately a welfare consideration, because you're talking about not losing life. Now, talking about the mid-90s and all the change there, in the mid-2000s, and Mike and Patrick have just had an amazing discussion on the 20 years since the 7/7 events in London in 2005. Now, that, I would say, my perspective both at the time and now, is how that was yet another manipulation in the narrative in order to change what it was that the country, the politicians, were going to do with the armed forces. And it was very, very interesting. If you go back and you look at what was being said by the Ministry of Defence, because of course we were already 4 years into an active operational theatre in Afghanistan, which had supposedly started, John Reed's words, without a shot being fired, which of course was never realistic, and then Iraq starting 2003. So we had two medium-sized operations going on, and the suggestion was never anything other than, okay, the goalposts always move, but whether it was regime change or stability to the region or any of those sorts of things. And then in 2005, it changed. And for me, the touchstone, what it was that triggered that was comments both made by Richard Dannett and Mike Jackson, who were successive heads of the army. The chronology is not quite right there because Dannett was later, but there was this suggestion that the armed forces weren't sort of getting to do what they wanted to do. They were underemployed, and there was reported to have been a conversation with Tony Blair, then Prime Minister, who basically didn't take to this idea very well, and the result of that, combined with the sort of this spectre of terrorism and then it being sort of going live in London, was the idea that somehow operations in Afghanistan and Iraq had a bearing on our security in the UK. And it was this idea that we were there to protect the UK and to keep our streets safe, which had just come from nowhere. That was never ever part of the sort of the operational plan or indeed the messaging around it. So it's a very, very interesting transition. And I think if you look at what's happened over the sort of succeeding 20 years, then it does explain an awful lot about how we've got to where we've got now. But to return to the point, I mean, I therefore, because of those operations, it meant that the pace of life, the tempo in the army was different from what it had been, say, for the 20 years prior, where there was a lot of time in a sort of garrison context where there'd be a lot of training activity, but nothing then perhaps after that. So people were by and large in the same place doing sort of similar, perhaps slightly repetitive things. I, however, spent a period of time where that wasn't the case at all. There was massive uncertainty. There was a huge mismanagement, let's say, of resources. So there was a lot of areas in which funding was cut, so access to training areas, and all sorts of things that should make an army career sort of interesting, exciting, and rewarding for everybody was being threatened. And then that led inevitably and sort of later towards and yet another panic, which was right. Well, these operations aren't going to last forever. What are we going to do next? And that's both from without and within, because as much as one might think that the military does to a large extent control what it does, the reality is actually very different. That's not at all what I saw happening. And to try to engineer the system so that you are going to be doing something is different. I mean, I personally ended up in East Africa. Well, I suppose I should say Eastern Africa, based in Kenya, and it was fascinating then to see how there was really a scramble for jobs, and people being pulled off to hold this idea of Somali piracy and all sorts of other things. So it was a real period of flux, but also it was the beginning. I don't want to jump ahead, and I'll absolutely hand over in a second. But it was also the beginning of the period of time where this idea that veterans were a sort of protected species started to come in. I think we'll go on perhaps later or at another time to talk about how that's been hugely manipulated. But that was what I saw, and I think during that period, for all the reasons that I've given, there was an enormous transition, which has absolutely not corrected itself, and the trend, as reported many times on UK Column, if you were to strip away all the control elements and the appalling situations in which the armed forces do get put, let's say, politically or strategically, in terms of messing up other people's countries. If you just take the organisation itself and the way in which there has been a deterioration and a loss of sort of quality and numbers, that was absolutely already happening then. It looked, to use your sort of language, it looked very deliberate, the way in which it was being done. But I can go on and talk about more of that later. But anyway, no, that's a little bit of.
Well, Charles, there was a lot there, and I was thinking as you're going through, there's so many points. So where do I start from that? I think I just want to ask you one more question before I respond, and that's you did join the army. Why did you do that?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and actually, in the first instance, it was almost by accident, which a lot of people have said over the years. Very specifically, and this is illustrative of somebody who's sort of good at their job. When I was at school, there was a sadly defunct. Well, I would say sadly because I thought it worked well. They ran a program called an Army Scholarship, which meant that you could, as a 16-year-old, you could go forward to the Regimental Selection Board and basically go through the officer selection as a schoolboy and get a place at Sandhurst for whenever it was you wanted to take it up. And I had been informed of this, so I went along to speak to the visiting careers officer, or whatever he was called, and my idea was that I was going along just for him to explain a little bit about it, which is how I came away from the conversation, only to get a letter in the post about 2 days later saying, delighted to meet you, so glad you've decided to go forward for the thing. And he had entered me into the process. So that was how it sort of took over. That's a sort of slightly silly detail. My family have a strong military background, which is absolutely not been a defining factor, but it did mean, and as I say, going back to the beginning about trying to civilianize this talk, it gave me an idea of the sorts of things that military life, army life in particular, entailed. And it wasn't the idea of sort of rigid discipline and being told what to do. It was actually totally the obverse, which was being able to be fit and do exciting, adventurous stuff and be paid for it, and use your brain at the same time. And I couldn't really, at that age or stage, imagine anything better. It was a huge appeal. I didn't really consider that there was any other profession out there that was offering in any way that kind of thing, as well as the enormous responsibility and privilege of helping other people run their lives in a command sense, and that was absolutely borne out by getting to my first platoon and having a bunch of, in the main, absolutely unbelievable individuals to look after, for
Yeah.
want of a better term. And I think it's a huge shame that okay, I'm talking about the perspective of an officer, but this is not exclusively the preserve of an officer, because everybody has this sort of welfare responsibility. And for people not to understand that that is such a huge part of it, I think is really regrettable. And I think it's also deliberate, because it does sort of desensitize the whole issue, and it enables, when expedient, for people in the armed forces to be sort of othered. They're not like us; they're different. And I think, again, that's a great shame. But that was a huge part of it. And the reason I make that point is that what I would like to say as a really distinct issue is that I was not at all drawn to the idea of guns and ammo. That was that was going to be part of it, but I was not one of those people who just wanted to, get on the ranges and fire off loads of ammunition, or indeed go into a theatre of conflict in order to kill people. That was never ever any of my motivation at all. But that was because, naively, Queen and country, even then, still to me meant something. And and this is the problem. But we can come back to that. But so yeah, that was the motivation. But anyway, Brian,
Charles, I'm glad I asked you the question, because I also got a scholarship, and at the age of 16, and this came about because my father had done wartime service in the Navy. He'd originally worked in the dockyard here in Devonport. In a particular year, I think it was the very beginning of 42, a small number of people from protected industries, and the dockyard was one of them, were actually called up. And I can't remember how many went from Devonport dockyard, several hundred, not on the scale of the thousands that worked there. It wasn't very many, but anyway, it resulted in my father spending the Second World War in the Navy. And he ended up a chief shipwright, chief petty officer. And he saw some things which, deeply upset him, but it was clear that he enjoyed a lot of his service time. But at the end of the war, he'd met my mum, which is probably a good thing. And he decided that he was going to come out, even though the Navy offered him the opportunity to stay on a full-time career, and they didn't do that with many people. So, that was a feather in his cap. But when I was a teenager, and you start thinking about what your career is, I was pretty uncertain. And then one week, my father announced that on the Wednesday, he was going to be taking me into, it was called HMS Flying Fox. It was a little ship that was alongside in Bristol. And this was just to have a chat. It's a parallel, just to have a chat. And so one very misty, cold morning, Dad and I drove down into Bristol, and I go on board HMS Flying Fox, and I meet a, well, he seemed quite old to me, but I suspect he was quite a young lieutenant. And the next minute, I was asked a whole load of questions about this and that, which I quite enjoyed, and I didn't find particularly difficult. And the next thing was a letter in the post inviting me for a full-week assessment, which was in Portsmouth. And as a result of doing that, I got a scholarship, which meant all I had to do was get 2 A levels. And then I would be able to go to Dartmouth, which is still the Royal Navy's officer training location. So that's what happened. I got my A levels, and the next minute I was just 18. Only a couple of weeks into being 18, I arrived at Dartmouth. And I've got to say, a lot of it for me was absolute fascination and curiosity, because immediately you were exposed to a very different sort of lifestyle, but also very quickly it was to do with boats. You were on the River Dart, and you were learning about boats and warships and being able to sail and mess around in boats. And much as you're saying, I found this very enjoyable. And I'll add, I was fascinated at that time by the number of people that bailed out the training. And I found this astonishing because some people decided after 2 weeks that they'd had enough. And I couldn't understand why they would leave at that point, because I thought you haven't seen enough. But they did, and subsequently, as the course progressed, and faces got blacked out on the photographs, and until we passed out, that's the terminology, we qualified, and it was about that time that the Navy suddenly announced that it was looking for people to go to university. And I'd made a specific decision in my head that I wanted to join the military. I didn't want to go to university. And suddenly here was the Navy pushing and pushing and pushing for these newly qualified midshipmen to go to university. And I ended up sort of asking some advice from some of the staff. And they all said, well, it's an incredible opportunity because you're going to be in London, you're going to be paid, and you get a degree, and this can't be bad. So in the end, I took it, and that meant that I went from the traditional training route through to university, got the degree, had a lot of fun, got the degree came back into the Navy, then to start the training properly, and eventually, you join the fleet at sea. So even my training period, there were these big changes happening, because prior to that, you'd had the system of young boys 12 through to 12 through to probably 17, doing a sort of cadetship with the Navy, and then they would become midshipmen, and then at that stage they go to Dartmouth. And so that was a very long introduction to a career in the military, and many of those young men that did it, we were going to the, let's say, up and into the 1930s, came from military families where their parents had been in the military for a long time. So you had this inherent understanding of what the military was about. And when I got to Dartmouth, I'd gone to a grammar school, but when I got to Dartmouth, that was a very different system of training. But previously, you had youngsters who had gone through a system, and they were very knowledgeable by the time they got to Dartmouth. So what am I trying to describe? I'm trying to describe that looking back, I can see that I already joined a system where the strength of families being involved with the military and people getting engaged with the military at a young age, that was being pushed aside. And to me, I could easily see that this was depriving the military of a lot of inherent strength from the amount of time that people had spent training. It was ingrained in them, and this is a very powerful thing. This is what makes good troops, when it's not they're just there for a career. It's something they really want to do, and they're very knowledgeable on the subject. So I find that very interesting that you also did a scholarship like that.
Yeah, I mean, well, this is it. I think you're right. The way in which these things have changed, and the view therefore from the outside. I mean, I think going back to the type of people that are drawn towards this or do this. So I'm actually very interested to hear about the number of people that dropped out. That was not. I mean, there may be exceptions. That certainly wasn't the case in my era at Sandhurst. There were a very small number of people who decided not to. Some people physically weren't up to it and therefore left, but by and large, people stayed. And actually, just to again further qualify the situation with the sort of the people element, which I think is so important. I well remember the opening address that we had from Sandhurst is split up on what would, I suppose, be a regimental basis, but they're at colleges. So you start off in old college, and therefore you have a commander who is a sort of seasoned lieutenant colonel, so it's kind of chief executive role, I guess. And I remember David Hill, who spoke to us and said the first thing he said was welcome. You have joined that group of society that picks up other people's rubbish, and it was very good. And I know the word integrity has difficult connotations for UK column because of the Integrity Initiative. But if we forget that for 1 minute, it wasn't him that said it, but it was always said that because this whole idea of army ethos and all that kind of thing. But integrity was always the big one. And to pull out that theme a little further, integrity was always described as being picking up other people's rubbish when no one's watching, and I think it is a point worth making because there are two elements to it. One is this idea that the military shapes the person, as opposed to the person having the aptitude for that system and therefore fitting into it well, adapting to it and getting the most out of it. There will always be debate on that, but my view is that predominantly people of a certain bent, of a certain character, will be drawn towards a particular organisation. And I think the military expressly, because ultimately it might lead to your death, so you have to be quite sure about whether or not you want to do it. So that's one side of it. The other side of it is that there is I can totally understand why, but there is a regard that people, once they've joined the armed forces, they are in effect trained killers. That's really all they're about. Which, yes, okay, that is true, because you're not really going to be of much use in an armed force if you're not doing that bit or able to do that bit. That is part and parcel of it. But that absolutely goes alongside the litter picking bit, in that the system simply doesn't work if people don't behave with terrific respect for one another, and any breach in that, any failure of that is catastrophic. And it's always the service test was always the determining factor in how a situation was looked at, which was does the situation, if there's been a breakdown in communications or discipline or whatever, does it fail the service test, which is does it compromise your operational effectiveness? And that I think there are don't want to get dragged too much down the kind of military bore thing, but there are so many really, really positive sort of universal elements from the way those systems were managed between people that could and should be transposed in a completely non-military sense, but into the civilian environment. And this goes back to what you're talking about, where there is this sort of intentional breakdown, and the idea of the sort of the service family thing being stopped, and all that. And I totally agree. And I think the consequence for society as a whole has been terrific. Yeah. And actually, if I may just use one anecdote, I can remember about 15 years ago, there was a very, very cold winter. It was the winter 2010-11. Climate change obviously hadn't started by that stage. So there was terrific ice. And at the time, I was living in a village that had a ford in the road that went out of the village. So you went down a relatively steep descent through the ford and up the other side. But because nobody had bothered, there was a huge amount of ice either side of it. Basically, people couldn't get in and out. And I okay, it wasn't something that I'd actually need to do for various reasons. But when it did become necessary to be able to clear that ice, I went down. It was -10 outside, and I started sorting the tracks and smashing it away with a shovel and whatnot. There was one other bloke who arrived more or less at exactly the same time, and he was a private soldier from the parachute regiment. He'd just been shot in the leg and was recovering. He'd been through had you got the sort of rehabilitation thing, and there we were, stripped down, t-shirts, pouring with sweat, and -10, clearing the path for this village. I don't say that so well, amazing. But the point is that it was two people who were both active servicemen who just decided to do something that a village of, I don't know, 300 people hadn't thought to do.
Yeah.
And neither of us. Sorry, the point is that we were both sort of visitors. Neither of us was actually living there full time. So I mean, it just and if you stop the system from working properly, then society doesn't have that sort of dividend, as it were, return to it.
But yeah, so it's a very interesting area, and for me, you saw this very quickly on board a ship, because a ship does not function if people are not working together, and you have all sorts of risks around you. So that that could be fire, or it could be flood, or it could be explosion. Ship is a pretty dangerous mix of things, because you've got people in a steel box with fuel and explosive in large quantities, and so there's an inherent need for people to be professional and reliable and trustworthy in order to survive in that environment. And you add to it, if a ship goes to sea in very rough weather, it requires that ship to work properly and to be sufficiently robust that you're going to come out the other side of the storm. And so you've got this wonderful environment of people who were very well trained, and also they'd built up a camaraderie together where people could rely on each other. They looked out for each other. And on top of that, the thing I remember of the Navy was a very quiet working environment. Most people were asked if they would do something. Occasionally they were told, but generally it was put across in a very soft way. And I always laughed when I started to see some of the BBC documentaries about the Navy. And certainly if I saw BBC documentaries about the army, because people were always shouting at each other. And this was something I'd never encountered. Maybe once or twice in a serious situation where somebody needed to shout because we're in the open air and you needed to get an order across. But the rest of the time, it happened in a very quiet, measured way. And the interesting thing is, and I think it is still the same today, but if you then went to the submarine service, where the danger was even greater because you're in a steel box with fuel and explosive or nuclear radiation and you're under the water, everybody has to know what they're doing. And yet the working environment is even quieter, and the relationship much softer between officers and the normal ranks. And why was it like that? Because everything was running very smoothly. And the other bit I'll sort of add to it is conversations that I remember, and usually the best conversations in the Navy are always during the night watches, because if you were officer of the watch, you were up on the bridge and you had two or three of the ship's company with you as lookouts or steering, and you would have conversations, very normal conversations about families and holidays and cars and whatever it was, always with a sense of humour. And so this idea that, as you say, that the military is just this way of ingraining in people that they're going to become trained killers, that was absolutely not what I saw. Were you expected to do your job, which ultimately, if we were at war, that does involve killing people, but the actual day-to-day society of the military was very relaxed and personable, and it was based on people skills.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I agree with you. In fact, trying to find a documentary about the army in which anyone actually speaks rather than shouts is difficult. And having been specifically having been a guardsman, where you spend quite a lot of your time shouting on a parade square, it's extraordinary. And of course, again, being infantry, most of what you're doing outside, in an active sense involves shouting because of the noise, but clearly there is another element to that. And no, I mean my memory of, I mean, all services behave differently for different reasons, but no, my memory was exactly the same. That things were conducted in a calm and rational manner, and actually this I think is such an interesting. It's not exactly a paradox, but these two things that are very closely related. That we have this system in which people know their job absolutely inside out and can depend with their life upon the person to either side of them.
Yeah.
That's the only way in which it works. And we were talking recently about how different this can be in the civilian environment, and my own experiences subsequent to leaving the army, in terms of having spent any time either working within or in close proximity to large corporations. I have seen the exact opposite. I have seen the vast majority of people with no real idea of where their job begins and ends, and what indeed they are supposed to do in that role. And actually, if the pressure increased, they would collapse because they don't get it. And there are lots of reasons why that might be the case, but ultimately, they're not going to die or get injured if they don't get it right. And yet, we talk about the humanity, the human side of the armed forces, but we cannot get away from the fact that ultimately, if they are exercised in the way that they are currently and have been for hundreds of years, lives are lost. And what I'd be very interested in your perspective is that, in retrospect, obviously, I don't believe there was any merit in any of the foreign interventions that were being conducted during the period of time that I spent in the army. Quite the opposite. I think they were really disgraceful engagements. But the difficulty is that people like me are still going to want to belong to those sorts of organisations because of all the sorts of things that we're talking about. Do you remember how you felt about the sorts of operational theatres that were either being entered into or that were likely, or your point of view on whatever one calls it, sort of foreign intervention? Because I find it's a very difficult thing to be absolute about because of all the other overwhelmingly positive attributes.
It's very interesting. This is a very interesting subject. I think I would have to say that for the first instance, during my career, the overwhelming thing was this was Cold War time. And so everything was focused around the Cold War scenario. We still had the British Army of the Rhine. There were still major exercises taking place in Germany. And that was all on the basis, of course, of the Soviet Union invading the West. And at sea, all of the exercises effectively were based on scenarios around, for me, locating and tracking and ultimately destroying Russian submarines, Soviet submarines. And the major exercises at sea used to be called the Teamwork series, and they were all based on, first of all, the American carrier groups moving across from the United States, principally into the North Atlantic and also up into the Norwegian Sea to project US air power across Norway, and protecting the northern flank and deterring the Soviet Air Force from moving down into the Norwegian Sea. The US carrier groups were the first role for the Royal Navy because we were to be part of the anti-submarine screen for those units, and I think we did a pretty good job. But of course, the carriers were the forefront of the supply ships coming across because nothing has changed from the Second World War. In order for a major war to be fought in Europe, the American industrial complex had to produce the munitions and the food and fuel and everything else, and that had to be transported in convoy across the North Atlantic. So for me, during the bulk of my time, it was clearly Cold War, and I didn't really pay attention to specific deployments overseas, although I did do one particularly boring patrol out in the Gulf when it was getting a little bit serious out there, but none of that was a sort of major deployment for the Royal Navy. The big thing for me was the Falklands, and that was particularly of great significance to me because I just started my warfare training. The career or my career in the Navy was that initially you work to train in basic navigation skills, and then you work to get your bridge watchkeeping ticket, which means you are capable of holding a watch on the bridge on your own day and night. And then when you've got those skills, then they start to move you forward to the warfare training. And so I went to HMS Dryad in Portsmouth to start that warfare training. And we were only a few weeks in when the Falklands started. And what came to the surface very quickly was that there was not enough warfare people at sea. And so I can't remember how many of us there were, but there was a relatively small number of us that were pulled off the course early, put on a ship and sent down to the Falklands. So I didn't even go through the full warfare training course because the Falklands started and rapidly there was this major escalation, and they were desperately short of certain people, including the warfare ones. So I was on board a frigate and sent off to the Falklands. And I have to say, I was very lucky because we got down there 2 days after the armistice was signed. And I then did some of it was interesting. I was going to say very boring patrol down there. And of course, you were there having missed all the glory. So anybody you encountered who had been there was very keen to say what they'd been doing, etc., etc. But we got down there after the fighting had stopped. So I have to be very thankful that I wasn't put in harm's way. Some of the people that I joined the Navy with died in the Falklands. And a couple of them I only discovered recently when I was doing a bit of research, and I was looking through the names of the deceased across the armed forces, and I suddenly thought, oh my goodness, I didn't realise he died. So, but the preparations for the Falklands obviously were taken very seriously, and yes, I got the experience of gearing up for war, and then of course, we started to hear the reports of the hits on the other ships, HMS Sheffield and Coventry, and the Type 21 frigates that were hit. So as we were on our way down, we knew that it was serious stuff and people were dying and being killed. So that was a pretty unique experience for me. And then after that, I specialised in anti-submarine warfare, and that was tracking the Russian nuclear submarines and bombers as they came out into the Atlantic. That was very good because it was real. It wasn't that we were on a training exercise. We were finding the real deal, the Russian submarines. And that was a very enjoyable time because I got a lot of satisfaction out of that work. And I will also add, we had huge respect for the Russian submariners because they were very capable people. And to answer your point, it was after that I eventually ended up in the Fishery Protection Squadron, where I had command of one of the fishery protection vessels, HMS Orkney. And that is when I really started to think about what we were doing, because it quickly became apparent to me that although the role of the Fishery Protection Squadron had been to protect police with a very small p British fishing boats at sea, what we were actually doing was imposing the European fisheries policy on those fishermen.
Mhm.
And a story that I've told in a lot of live talks over the years is that one very dark winter's night, we boarded a Scottish fisherman up in more or less the entrance to the Firth of Forth. And he was breaking the rules for the size of his net. We weren't able to make a decision on the spot. We always had to refer to Ministry of Agriculture and Fisheries, as it was then. So there was a dedicated team, and they told us very clearly that we were to confiscate his net. And the Scottish captain of that boat told me in some pretty colourful language that I was destroying his effing livelihood.
Mm.
And I knew that that was exactly true. And I also knew that when I was travelling around the North Sea or up around the Shetlands and Falkland Islands doing the fishery patrols, we were seeing EU-funded fishing boats for the French and the Spanish and the Germans in particular, brand new boats paid for with European money that were simply wiping the oceans of fish and destroying the livelihoods of the British fishermen. And I started to feel deeply uncomfortable about that. And it was actually that experience that made me get to a point where I thought, this is not for me. And so I left. So, ironically, it wasn't a military style requirement of the armed forces that brought that home to me. I never experienced a deployment, where we were operating in the waters of some foreign country where I thought, are we doing the right thing? For me, it was the fishery protection where I knew it was not the right thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fascinating, and again, for actually both military and civilian audience, I think it's one of the things that I have referred to quite a number of times on the news, and I think it's so worth bringing out is that all activities are governed by rules of engagement. Any operational deployment, whatever, there are set conditions under which you may or may not use force or return fire or fire upon, and I think it is so little understood, and it's certainly not. It was, I'm fairly confident, it was never expressly said in any of the laws of armed conflict training that I undertook. But when you look at how it's written down, which is in Joint Services Publication JSP 398, and you read what it says about rules of engagement, that the rules of engagement are the use of force as a political expression. It does just make you think about everything in a completely different way, because within that environment, whether it doesn't matter where you are, whether that there are, for every situation, there are rules of engagement. They do get changed, but you're always led to believe that has come from within your command structure, and as though there is an appraisal of the situation, an appraisal of what would be regarded as risk or threat or whatever. But actually, that's not where it comes from. All of this is a political expression, a political act, and this is where the difficulty lies, and that's why I find it so interesting to listen to you talk about these periods. What the only thing I was going to ask as a follow up is, do you remember either at the time or afterwards anybody ever questioning either what happened in the lead up to or in the Falklands, or indeed in the activities concerning the sort of monitoring of the Great Soviet Bear? Was there the sense that it was not quite as it was being sold?
I'd say not in the Soviet time, but then I'm going to say my perception of what was going on was I was very young, and you're doing a particular job, And just little something that comes into my mind during the Cold War, one of the things that the Soviets did, the Soviet military exercises, they always talked with real place names. Whereas if NATO exercised, usually, inevitably, we would be running to some exercise scenario. And if there was a country defined or a power block, the red power block, you were talking about targets that were always given code names, low-grade code names. But when the Soviets were doing their exercises, they would be talking about advancing, 30 miles further into West Germany, and they would be talking about the names of the places that they were going to be taking. Now, was that a bit of propaganda to put the West under pressure? Absolutely. But of course, that did make you think that their intent was real. So I'm going to say that Cold War period people were very heavily focused, and there was a lot of deep concern about Soviet capability and, of course, strength in numbers, because they had very big military and certainly very big submarine fleet. And so there was an inherent, I'll say, fear with a small f about the bear. No, I didn't get any pushback, see any pushback about that period. The Falklands was mainly, the pushback actually was against, UK, because people knew very early on that we'd run into major problems in the Falklands because we hadn't got the ships or equipment. And very often it was clear that within the Royal Navy, people had been warning and complaining about this for a long time. I mean, one of the key things is that ships started to appear, new design ships started to appear during the Cold War that had very few weapon systems on them. And the moment the Falklands blew up, everybody said, well, you're going to be facing fighter ground attack aircraft close to coastal areas. We need traditional weapons. We need 20 millimeter, 30 millimeter guns. And the ships didn't have them. So what then transpired was this rapid retrofitting of ships with anything they could find. And the frigate that I was on board, HMS Sirius, which had 4 Exocet missiles. It had SEACAT, surface-to-air missiles, which, although old, proved that missile system proved pretty capable in the Falklands. We had a couple of single 20 millimeters, and they ended up fitting a twin 20 millimeter on the bridge. But that twin 20 millimeter was not a modern weapon. It was a relic from the Second World War. And so ships went down there, many of them ill-equipped for the battle that the Argentinians could bring, against the British, and we paid the price for that. And when you look back at good military analysis of the Falklands, we were very, very lucky. And the bombs not exploding in Bomb Alley when the Argentinian pilots dropped bombs and they didn't arm properly. That was just unbelievable luck for the fleet. So I quickly saw from my own Falklands experience that the military power that was looking after, the political power that was looking after the military was absolutely failing to provide what the military needed. And every year that I served, we were being told there were going to be further cuts in manpower and ships and training. That was one of the things that happened. And the other thing that happened with increasing frequency was some form of reorganization. And this might be the renaming of professional tasks within the military. It could be to do with absolutely stupid changes to the uniforms. It changes to the badges. So in an organisation, which I would say, when it's working properly, there's inherent stability, and people know not only the organisational structure, they know all the systems and they know the training everybody's had. That became ever more turbulent, and you could see the effects. So initially, you just put it down to the people who kick-started these changes lacked common sense. That's what your mind told you. But later, I started to come to the conclusion that these damaging changes were not a lack of common sense; they were orchestrated,
Yeah.
and that's when. That was before my time with a fishery protection squadron, but that's when I started to think there's something malevolent at work.
Yeah, and I think that's totally fascinating. And Julian Assange's words spring to mind with the forever war. The goal is not to have a successful war, but an endless one. And it's fascinating. And although a sort of a different period, but this is exactly what I saw. My period in the army coincided with two, in terms of tech, two significant changes. One was the digitization of all radio comms from the Klansman system, which was absolutely brilliant because it worked absolutely everywhere. It didn't matter how many bogs and puddles and whatever you dropped it in, it still worked. To Bowman, which was, I don't know whether people consider that it works now, but it was absolutely hopeless at the start, and the all comms would drop all the time, and it took forever to reinitialize. And you can imagine in a battlefield context that is just not workable. So those two things were changed. Oh, sorry, that one thing was changed, and that had I would say a very detrimental effect. Not least because, in actual fact, the other thing was that it required considerable skill to understand how to use that technology. So it wasn't there was not a universality in the way that there was. And just to explain to people that it's sort of the difference between a push button and a smartphone. The push button thing, you kind of know what it's going to do, in the way that the analog radio thing just was a radio with dials, and you just clicked a battery onto it. There were lots of different types, as opposed to it all being digital and having to have complicated processes attached. And the other thing was a supposed personnel management system. All personnel stuff was run from Glasgow, and they went on to a system, JPA, it was called Joint Personnel Administration, I think. And again, it just didn't work. And going back to Assange's thing and exactly what we were describing in the Falklands, if the armed forces capability, and I say this with all the with the NATO summit, recent NATO summit in mind, the defence review and all this kind of stuff. But if it can absolutely do what it is supposed to do, and we are to imagine that there is a sort of justifiable conflict, and we really were able to deliver the effect that we promise, it would be over within minutes. But of course, by hampering the capability, it means that it can be extended to the enormous benefit of the war industry. And we need to look at the Strategic Defence Review and the National Security Strategy to see that that is nothing more than a business plan for these industries. And when you do start to think about it like that, so much more of it makes sense, to sort of keep the system going, but continually hamstring it in order that you get your forever wars. I know that might seem like a terribly cynical way to look at it, but I think when you've gone through the system, it's very hard to consider it in another way, because I saw exactly the same thing with, less so with Iraq, but Afghanistan in particular, the advent of what were called urgent operational requirements, which was the sort of the then process of just fixing a 30mm cannon to the front. It wasn't, but it was just buying off the shelf kit that wasn't in the budget, that no one had training on. I mean, it was chaos. It was absolute chaos, and therefore it meant that the effect on the ground was not what it should have been because of it. And don't tell me that no one could have seen that coming. And we go back to things.
My experience was people did see these things coming, and they were constantly warning about it. And we could go a strategic scale, we could go very small scale, but for a strategic thing, there was the announcement, whatever year it was, that they were going to get rid of the Royal Navy's aircraft carriers.
Yes.
And everybody said, what are you talking about? Because those aircraft carriers, apart from anything else, invariably formed the task group that the Royal Navy produced in order to integrate with the American carrier battle groups. We were part of the outer screen, and our carriers carrying anti-submarine helicopters or ASW planes were part of that outer screen. So people started to question this decision, and of course it trickled down through the Navy structure. And there was a sufficient backlash that they were known as the through-deck cruisers. This was a new proposal design. People worked hard enough to say, well, actually, the through-deck cruiser should be changed to make it more aircraft carrier-like. And I think we were grateful that we did get these new small aircraft carriers, but of course they didn't have an angled flight deck, they didn't have a catapult system, and therefore they were very limited in the aircraft they could carry. They could carry the Harrier, and the Harrier did very well during the Falklands, but if we had had carrier-launched airborne early warning aircraft, which of course the Americans had and we had previously with the old carriers, a lot of the damage in the Falklands wouldn't have happened.
Yeah.
But somebody made a decision that we were going to get rid of carriers. Then when the new carriers came in, there was a gap, and that means you lose all the training.
Of course.
And this was something you saw happening time and time again.
Yeah.
And the other one I'll just mention was that at one stage, when I'd got a lot of experience in the particular sonar systems that we were using to track the Russians, this is a long towed array. So it's like a hose pipe full of microphones, and you're listening to sounds in the water, and you can detect the sounds of vessels and submarines. But we had a particular sonar. It was produced by Marconi. They were very excited when they produced it. It was taken to sea for tests, and its performance was outstanding. Nobody had ever seen anything like it. And so eventually this particular sonar set was fitted in the frigate squadron that I was part of. And then we very quickly started to go to sea on these real life detection trips to find the Russian nuclear submarines. Well, eventually we were told that the Admiralty Research Department was going to create an update of this sonar system. And because computer technology had moved on, the cabinets for it, instead of being the size, I'll say, if you know the size of a double door fridge, an American double door fridge, the cabinet to drive my sonar system was 3 of those side by side. And the Admiralty Research organisation said they could produce a computer that would do the same job about the size of your average domestic fridge, big domestic fridge. When the new sonar system was fitted, it very quickly became apparent it wasn't as good, or it wasn't as performing well. And eventually I was sent to sea with 2 ships, one with one system, one with the other system, where we did a controlled trial to see what was going on. Was it the equipment at fault, or was it the training of the operators? And it quickly became apparent that the old system was better than the new one. So what did they do? They took out all the old systems and replaced it with a new sonar. And it was at that point that I realized that whoever was controlling the operation was not interested in you doing the job or in your lives, because if they're giving you duff equipment, they don't care what happens to you. And so that was one of my key examples of realizing that the machinery driving the military wasn't everything we thought it was.
And I think anyone listening who has any military experience will, I'm sure, have an example of exactly
that,
that springs to mind.
yeah.
Yeah, it's completely
Yeah.
commonplace. I think we might be nearly out of time, but what I would say is that there's so much more to talk about that I think we should definitely do this again, because I think we need to sort of bring ourselves into the more recent era.
present day.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
so. So we should draft
Charles,
up an agenda for.
It's been an interesting experiment because there is a big difference in our time frames for serving in the military, because I left in '93, so well before you joined. But it hasn't been difficult to have a conversation where we know what we're talking about, even though you're from an army background and I'm from a navy background, and I find that very interesting.
Yeah, so do I, and I think that absolutely is a generational thing. I mean, I always think for the sort of civilian audience, I've always taken enormous pleasure in talking to the old and bold, as we fondly refer to them. But at regimental gatherings, speaking to people of previous generations by some margin, and finding that you absolutely speak the same language, and that goes across services as well. And I think that is absolutely fantastic. But it is, it's not a surprise. But to find that there is that much common ground between our experiences is still sort of amazing, until you start to consider that absolutely these things are all done with intent, and those people making those decisions are by and large doing that for the same set of reasons.
Just a final comment from me, and perhaps this should have come up front, but there was no planned structure to this, so
very unmilitary. Really have several oldest groups.
So I think it's much better because we've weaved around. We wouldn't have done that if we'd planned the structure.
Flexibility.
But I just wanted to say that we're having a conversation where we are starting to get a bit critical about matters to do with defence and the military, and I think it's important to say that I know for you, we still have great respect for the people who are serving. And I think it's such a huge shame that many of the people serving today are doing so within a system which is rapidly being exposed as a lie. I think that's the best way I can put it.
And I won't add to that. I think that's a very good note upon which to end, and we can go back and revisit exactly that theme.
Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you very much, Charles.